So let me take the opportunity to welcome everybody on behalf of the International Geothermal Association to this webinar on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Scope 2 update. My name is Gregor Rumberg. I'm the Global Event Manager of the IGA and therefore also responsible for our global events as well as webinars. And I will guide you through today's webinar. But fortunately, I'm also not alone, and I have two amazing people here with me. I have Noor Khadanfar from Fervo Energy, Chief of Staff from Fervo Energy with me, as well as Devon Swezey, Senior Manager Global Energy and Climate at Google. And yeah, we really look forward to get a deep dive into the Scope 2 update. We will leave some space at the end of this webinar for question and answers. At the moment, during the webinar, your cameras and your microphones are muted, cameras are deactivated. But at the end of this session, we will allow you to either ask your questions verbally, but also we will follow the chat. So also if you have any questions in between, please feel free to ask in the chat. Yeah, but without wasting more time, I would give the word to Devon with an introduction to the topic. Thank you very much, everyone.
Great. Thank you so much, Gregor, for the introduction, and to you and the International Geothermal Association for having me today. Let me share my screen here. Is that coming up? Yes. Okay, great. Great. Well, thank you very much. It's really an honor to be here today. So my name is Devon Swezey. I am a senior manager on Google's energy team, and I'm also a member of the Greenhouse Gas Protocoll's Scope 2 Technical Working Group. And I'm here today to give you all an update on the proposed revisions to the Scope 2 guidance, and specifically the market-based method, which is now under public consultation, and I'll explain more about that. First, I want to emphasize that I'm speaking here today in my personal capacity, and my remarks today are not made on behalf of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, its secretariat, or the Scope 2 Technical Working Group Technical Working Group as a whole. So here's the agenda that I'm going to cover today. First, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the Scope 2 guidance. Second, I will summarize the process that has been underway for a number of years now to update the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, a suite of corporate standards. And then I'll present on the key updates in the Scope 2 update in particular, focusing on updates to the market-based method. And finally, I will discuss the public consultation, which has just opened a couple of days ago and runs until the 19th of December. This is really a critical period for the geothermal industry to make its voice heard on this topic. Okay, let's get started. So what is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, or GHGP for short? Well, the GHGP's mission is to develop the most credible, accessible, and widely used greenhouse gas accounting and reporting standards, and to proactively facilitate their global adoption and implementation. And indeed, today, the GHGP is the world's most widely used greenhouse gas accounting standard for companies. In fact, in 2023, 97% of the S&P 500 companies that disclosed their emissions used the GHGP as the rule book for doing so. The GHCP is a 20-year partnership between two NGOs, the World Resources Institute and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And their foundational standard is the Corporate Accounting and Reporting Standard, which was originally published back in 2004 and is shown here on the right. This standard organizes corporate emissions into three different what are called scopes. So scope 1 emissions are direct emissions from sources that are owned and controlled by a company. Scope 2 emissions are the emissions from acquired and consumed electricity, steam, heat, or cooling. And scope 3 essentially captures all other indirect emissions. And today we'll be focusing on the scope 2 emissions category. So now let's turn to the Scope 2 guidance, which remember relates to electricity emissions. So this was published in 2015 to clarify the way that companies should report their Scope 2 emissions. And it requires a dual reporting structure with two different numbers that should be reported side by side. The first number is location-based scope 2 emissions, and that reflects the average emissions intensity of the electricity grid where a company is consuming power. So your location-based emissions are essentially the amount of electricity that you consume in a given period, multiplied by the average emissions factor for the grid where you are consuming electricity. But the guidance also established the market-based method, which measures electricity emissions based on the electricity that companies choose to purchase. And that method allows for the purchase and use of energy attribute certificates, which are more commonly referred to as renewable energy certificates or RECs in the United States or guarantees of origin in Europe, to be used to reduce a company's market-based scope 2 emissions. The original guidance also established a number of quality criteria for how these EACs should be used to reduce scope 2 emissions. And two of those quality criteria are listed here on the slide. The first of which is that they should be issued and redeemed as close as possible to the period of energy consumption to which the instrument is applied, and that they should also be sourced from the same market in which the reporting entity's electricity consuming operations are located and to which the instrument is applied. Now, as the GHGP themselves note at the bottom of the slide in a recent communication that they published earlier this month, what that means in practice is that companies use same year certificates from anywhere within a national or even multi-country market, which can be much broader than the physical grids and the hours that actually supply consumption. So the next slide here shows a visual representation of how this works today, in this case for the United States. And this graphic comes from a Financial Times story that was published last year on this topic. It shows how a facility that is consuming electricity, in this case at nighttime in the PJM grid in the eastern United States, can purchase renewable energy certificates from solar projects in Nevada to claim that it is using renewable energy and thus reducing its scope 2 market-based emissions for its consumption in PJM. There is both a, therefore, temporal disconnection in that the solar EAC is applied to nighttime consumption, as well as a geographic disconnection in that the solar power that's produced in Nevada cannot be delivered to where it is actually claimed in the PJM grid. And I should note that this same dynamic also applies in Europe, where all of Europe is also treated as one boundary today for the purposes of market-based scope 2 accounting. So for instance, if instead this map was showing a facility consuming power in Poland and purchasing guarantees of origin from a solar project in Spain, they can use those GOs to reduce their market-based scope 2 emissions from nighttime consumption at the facility in Poland. So the same dynamic applies. Okay, so before explaining the proposed revisions to the Scope 2 update or standard, I want to spend just a couple of minutes on the governance of this update process, because I think it's important to note that this has actually been going on for a long time. So in 2022 is when the process actually started, and there was an initial public consultation to provide feedback on the standards updates, including the Scope 2 guidance. And the Scope 2 consultation received over 400 submissions from organizations across the globe. The GHGP subsequently created a technical working group for each accounting standard update. And the Scope 2 technical working group that I'm a member of has 45 members total, which includes experts from the corporate sector, the energy industry, the NGO community, and also academia. And it includes representatives from all over the world. And the process has also been very transparent. The GHGP publishes minutes and all presentation slides to a public governance repository after the conclusion of each meeting. Now, if you look at the graphic on the top right, this describes the governance structure of the update. So starting from the bottom, there's the technical working groups, which are these multi-stakeholder bodies that support the development of the technical content. They also work with the GHCP Protocoll Secretariat, which is the body that runs the day-to-day activities of the update. Next, the Independent Standards Board, or ISB, oversees the standard development process and reviews and approves of the protocol standards and any changes related to the standards. And finally, the steering committee exists to provide strategic guidance on the goals and direction of the protocol overall. And I think it's also important to note that the update is guided by a set of decision-making criteria shown here at the bottom right, which are integrity, impact, and feasibility. And these criteria, which are ranked in a hierarchy, are intended to support the evaluation of different options for how to revise these standards going forward. So this slide shows the overall timeline of the revisions to the Scope 2 standard. As you can see, we are now about halfway through the process, and we've reached a really significant milestone with the first public consultation opening, which I'll come back to at the end of the presentation. Based on this timeline, we expect that the final updated Scope 2 standard will be published at the end of 2027. Okay, so now let's dive into the details of the Scope 2 revisions, which are summarized in this graphic, which is provided by the GHGP. So one thing to note is that these proposals were approved by a significant majority of the Scope 2 Technical Working Group earlier this summer, as well as by the Independent Standards Board, which voted 10-1 in July to approve these updates for public consultation. Now, there are proposed updates for both location-based and market-based accounting, but I'm going to focus today on the market-based method, which is highlighted now in green in the middle of the slide. And there are 4 key updates to discuss. The first is that the proposal would require companies to substantiate market-based emissions based on hourly matching. Now, if you recall from that previous slide with the map of the United States, today's standard allows companies to net their purchased clean energy on an annual basis to reduce emissions. But this update would instead require that market-based emissions could only be reduced if the unit of clean electricity that is being claimed is produced in the same hour as the consumption that is claiming it. The second update is this concept of deliverability, which means that there is a reasonable expectation that the claimed clean electricity can actually reach the point of use. In practice, this means a narrowing of applicable geographic boundaries in places like North America or in Europe, where instead of continental boundaries as they exist today, boundaries would look more similar to power markets. So for instance, ISOs or RTOs in the United States or bidding zones in Europe. And it's important to note that there's also proposals for demonstrating cross-border or cross-boundary delivery of purchased clean energy to load as well. Third, the update introduces a new concept called standard supply service, which proportionally allocates energy that is mandated by law or publicly owned. So the idea is that each reporter would only be able to claim its pro rata share of standard supply service assets, and that any unclaimed attributes are not available for voluntary market-based claims. So the idea is to prevent resources that should be fairly allocated to all customers or all consumers from being procured by specific organizations. And therefore, it also has the effect of narrowing the pool of attributes available for voluntary purchases. And finally, there's an update to what emissions factors can be used for any consumption that is not matched by procured clean energy. So today, most companies rely on the average grid mix for this calculation, but this leads to double counting of clean generation that might rightfully be claimed by others. And so therefore, the revision proposes that only what's called the residual mix, which excludes that claimed consumption, can be used. And where no residual mix exists, companies should use fossil-only emission rates for unmatched consumption. Okay, so now I want to turn your attention to the right side of this slide, which lists a number of measures that have also been proposed, very important to ensure the feasibility in the implementation of this new standard once it comes into effect. So the first feasibility measure is that where primary electricity data is unavailable at an hourly level, companies can use profiles to estimate their hourly electricity consumption. So these could be facility-specific or industry-specific load profiles, or reporters could simply use a flat average for their reporting, meaning that they could take their, for instance, monthly amount of electricity that they consume as represented on their invoice and divide that by the number of hours in a month in order to get a flat load shape that they can use for accounting. Second, the update contemplates exemption thresholds for different reporters based on load or reporter size, which would essentially exempt sufficiently small electricity loads within a given boundary from the requirement to do hourly accounting, and those consumers could do annual accounting instead. Third, there is a legacy clause that's being proposed, which would allow investments that have already been made, as well as new long-term contracts signed before the applicability of these new rules, to continue to count as they do under the existing standard. Now, this is important to ensure that the investments made under existing rules are not penalized under a future system. And finally, there is expected also to be phased implementation to facilitate a smooth transition to new requirements. So even if the standard is finalized at the end of 2027 as scheduled, the implementation is expected to phase in over multiple years, which would give organizations and data providers, utilities, et cetera, time to adapt. And lastly, I want to touch on another important piece of this broader update that is moving forward in parallel, and that is the horizontal box at the bottom of the slide that's now highlighted in green. So in addition to the proposed changes to the calculation of the Scope 2 market-based inventory, the ISB has also approved the development of what's called consequential accounting methods that are used to estimate the avoided emissions of actions taken outside the inventory. And that will be developed by a different technical working group called the Actions and Market Instruments Working Group. And so what does this mean? So well, imagine you are a company that is consuming electricity in the United States, but you want to purchase electricity from a solar project in India, even if you don't have consumption in that country. So consequential accounting would essentially be used to estimate the emissions avoided by that solar project relative to a counterfactual scenario where that purchase had not occurred. And so a company would be able to use those avoided emissions not to reduce their Scope 2 inventory, but to get credit in some other way. And this work stream is intended to improve, standardize the methodologies to estimate those avoided emissions. So now I want to touch on the rationale for these changes, and this is actually taken directly from a recent communication by the GHCP from earlier this month. And so I'll just go through these very briefly, because I think there's kind of two main things that they focus on. One is accuracy. So ensuring accurate and credible Scope 2 emissions. We need to think about two different realities of electricity systems that need to be addressed. The first is that electricity is produced and consumed nearly instantaneously. It's not physically possible to have consumed electricity that is generated at a different time as consumption without the use of energy storage. And therefore, a generator-specific claim is most accurate when the generation occurs at approximately the same time as the consumption to which it is matched. And then the second is related to this geographic dimension I mentioned earlier, which is that electricity is distributed on grids that don't always align with national boundaries. And so to improve accuracy and credibility, claims should come from resources on the same grid or a grid that is linked by transmission that can physically deliver claimed electricity to the point of consumption. And the second important reason highlighted is related to supporting ambitious climate action. And so hourly and deliverability requirements essentially break up the supply of certificates into more granular times and locations. This can create scarcity and price signals for renewable energy in locations and times when it's not abundant, which a number of research studies indicate could have better system-wide impacts in terms of driving decarbonization. And additionally, hourly price signals create financial incentives for energy technologies that are not really valued under today's standard, but that we know are needed to fully decarbonize electricity systems, such as energy storage, clean, firm, dispatchable power, and demand response. So how could these Scope 2 updates support the geothermal industry? Well, I found this quote from the International Energy Agency, which actually published a paper last year on the integration of solar and wind. And they talk about a potential impact of these shorter matching periods, such as that being proposed in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol update. They write, corporations seeking to match their demand with clean generation may be tempted to purchase power from the cheapest resources, often solar PV, regardless of temporal alignment with their demand and the availability of grids. Compared to yearly matching, shorter matching periods can deliver a more diverse clean energy portfolio, bringing wind, batteries, and clean dispatchable capacities online, in addition to cheaper solar PV. So recall, today's standard doesn't recognize the variability of resources like wind and solar because it's based on an annual matching scheme. And so by bringing more recognition of the reality of how power is generated and delivered, it can also create incentives for companies to consider how clean and dispatchable technologies like geothermal can play a role in decarbonizing their demand. So this is my final slide, just to flag that the public consultation of these proposed changes is open now. It just opened a couple of days ago, and it is open until the 19th of December. And there are two separate consultations that are open simultaneously. One is on the Scope 2 update, as I've described here, and the second on this topic of consequential accounting in the electricity sector. The GHGP is hosting a webinar next week on the 27th of October to provide an overview of the consultation, and I highly recommend all of you tune in. And finally, now is the time to make your voice heard. This 60-day period is a really critical time to hear from all stakeholders about these updates, and definitely very much encourage the IGA and any company members of the IGA to consider putting in comments to this standard. So with that, I will stop sharing and turn it back over to you, Gregor.
Thank you very much. Fantastic presentation. And I think I'm not the only one who has a couple of questions, but before we come to that, I invite Noor to give us an industry perspective from Fervo. So the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Gregor. And it's a pleasure to be with you all. I learned a lot from Devon's own presentation, so excited to get into the discussion in a little bit. But what I will do is I'll go ahead and share my screen and I'll talk a little bit about Fervo, our mission as a company. Probably this audience is very well versed in the differences between hydrothermal, EGS, essentially what Fervo is really looking at. But I'll dive into a little bit of that and then address how Fervo is also looking at Scope 2 emissions. But yeah, my name is Noor Gadanfar. I'm Chief of Staff at Fervo Energy. And at Fervo, really, our mission is to leverage innovation in geoscience to accelerate the world's transition to sustainable energy. And so much of our mission is embedded in every single thing that we do, and we think about it often as we make decisions day to day. And this is highly pertinent today because specifically in the US, we're seeing electric load growth growing faster than it ever has in 2 decades. And by 2030, we are forecasting that we will need 120 additional gigawatts on the grid to meet that demand. And some of that is coming from data centers, but some of that is also coming from the electrification and manufacturing of so many things. And so to put that into context, 120 gigawatts is enough to power New York City in peak demand in the summertime. And so that's kind of like the scale that we are looking at. And geothermal is very well versed to help address a lot of that growing power demand. Before I dive into what Fervo is doing, specifically, I want to talk about just traditional geothermal. And it's been around for over 100 years. So what is it? And so the way I like to describe it specifically to people with no background is when you think back to third grade science class, the core of the earth is hot and it's always hot. So what if we could use that heat to create energy? And so when you think of geysers in California or power facilities in near hot springs in Iceland, that's effectively the image of geothermal that you come up with. And what you do is you would drill 2 wells. And these wells have to be drilled in an area where the reservoir is hot. There is naturally occurring water and naturally occurring fractures. And so we drill the first well, and you hope you hit a fracture, and then you drill a second well that is spaced adequately but also hits a fracture. And then effectively you would inject water, pump it through, it will rise up and then create steam that spins a turbine that creates electricity. Now, this is a fantastic way to create energy, but it's geographically constrained. So there's a lot of subsurface uncertainty when it comes to this. And in fact, in traditional hydrothermal, 1 in 3 wells that have been drilled have been dry holes. But what Fervo does is we actually take a playbook out of oil and gas, specifically the shale revolution. And so while traditional geothermal relies on the natural architecture of the subsurface, through EGS, we're actually able to engineer the subsurface to create those ideal conditions so we can extract the resource fully and efficiently. So what we do is we drill a doublet, an injector and a producer, and then we drill both vertically, and then we go horizontally. And we hydraulically fracture in order to create those cracks. And it's that eliminates the dry hole risk. So you can think about it like an underground radiator where we flow water into one well, it circulates and heats up in the reservoir, and then comes out of the other. It turns the turbine and generates electricity. And what we do is effectively just create a more predictable geothermal system. The type of turbine that Fervo uses is an organic Rankine cycle turbine. So it's a closed loop system that generates zero emission. And in fact, it's 24/7, it's always on, clean, firm baseload power. And what we see is that when we apply EGS in the context of the United States specifically, you can see that while we have roughly 4 gigawatts in operation for conventional today, we can unlock thousands of gigawatts using enhanced geothermal. And the map that you see on the right side, it just shows how hot the rock can get at specific temperatures. I believe here it's up to 5 kilometers. But if we drill deeper, if we double that, you'll see that most of the map in the US will actually start turning red. And so one of the things that we think about from an economic perspective is as we come down the drilling cost curves, and Fervo has extensively spoken about that previously, so I won't touch on this today, but we just find that we can access a lot of the resource in a much more economic way. And so one of the benefits, specifically relating back to some of Devon's comments, was that geothermal is 24/7 clean, firm power. And when we're thinking about climate goals and climate targets, intermittent power, so let's say just wind on its own or solar on its own, is really insufficient to reach full decarbonization. And firm power is needed to ensure reliability. And so what we see here on the left is actually what is labeled as the duck curve. So you kind of see like during the middle of the day, let's say peak solar resource, peak wind resource, you'll see that you don't need as much power, but that persistently goes up during the night. And so given geothermal's sort of firm profile, that effectively eliminates the duck curve. And when we think about high capacity and low emission, geothermal is really the only resource today that has both the technological maturity to be able to be deployed in multiple contexts. So when we're thinking about what the life cycle carbon emissions are, effectively, when you think of it, it's roughly 20 grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour of electricity. And then there are a host of other environmental benefits that are specifically beneficial when you use Fervo's enhanced geothermal. So, for example, we use zero freshwater consumption. We can run our entire operation on brackish water. So we're not pulling resources from either agricultural or human consumption at all. And then we have a very low surface land use footprint. So we typically will say we need roughly 1.5 acres per megawatt. And when you think of that in solar, that's roughly 6 acres per megawatt. So much lower surface land use footprint. So Fervo back in 2022, 2023, we launched Project Red, which was our commercial pilot project with Google as our development partner. And effectively, what we did was we said, okay, we needed to test that enhanced geothermal was going to work the way we said it would. And so we drilled a doublet. And we actually used the surface facility resources of an underperforming geothermal power plant. It was owned by CERC. It's called the Blue Mountain Power Plant in Nevada. And so we said, let us come onto your field, let us drill this doublet, and we will sell you the brine if successful. If not successful, you incur no cost. And in fact, when we did, this was the most productive enhanced geothermal project that was put online in history. And the table you see here is just showing you that the operational track record, so the midterm production profile of this doublet, which shows that not only were the wells as hot as we said that they were going to be, but in fact, they stay hot. And today, Project Red is still online and still operating within that same production profile. So again, I think going back to that question of reliability, Project Red being online for 2 years almost now is very much a case for that. And what we're doing right now is actually we are building our first greenfield development, so both the subsurface and surface facilities. And it's a 500 megawatt project under construction. Phase 1, which is roughly 100 megawatts, begins in 2026. Phase 2, which is around 400 megawatts, begins in 2028. We have contractual offtake for all 500 megawatts, all of which are going to California, specifically because California's Public Utility Commission mandated that they needed 1.1 gigawatts of clean firm power procured by various load-serving entities within the state. And so that was, I think, partly in recognition of just the importance of having not only a reliable source of power, but a clean one. And so I'll show you what this looks like. This was a flow test from August of 2024, which effectively confirms the resource. We found that in our first project, Project Red, we were able to generate 3.5 megawatts out of a single well. Over here, we're generating 10 megawatts out of a single well. So again, I think coming down the cost curve, ensuring greater productivity has just proven just how much of a important and effective resource geothermal can be in the context of the grid. And so once our power plant is built, and I'll show you pictures of that as well, you won't be seeing this steam. This is just a test that we do just for confirmation, because like I mentioned, it's a zero emission closed loop system. And so this was in August of 24. What you're seeing now is when we first broke ground on our first power plant in Cape Station in October of 24. And the next photo shows you in September of 25, sort of the progress that we've made. And so when we're thinking about speed to power specifically, not only is geothermal 24/7 firm baseload power, but in fact, we can get it connected and up and running very, very quickly within the context of a size of a 100 megawatt plant. And so it'll begin in operations next year. Which brings me back to our mission statement, which talked about accelerating the world's transition to sustainable energy. And at Fervo, we like to walk the walk and talk the talk. And so one of the things that we did at Cape Station effectively was we electrified the drilling rig in August 31 of 2024. So we've been operating a fully electric drilling rig, not diesel powered since then. And all our construction power in February, starting February of 2025, has also been electrified. So again, we have moved away from using diesel generation and have moved towards using utility highline power. And what that looks like is for the drilling rig specifically, we've avoided over 3,000 metric tons of carbon emissions as a result. And there's been a 96% reduction in NOx emissions as well. And so we have made a public promise that to the extent possible, we will use utility highline power because it's a cleaner source. And eventually, the hope is we will be able to power our own rig using geothermal energy once the plant is up and running as well. So that would just be a huge win, I think, for us, and to be able to say that we are powering our own rig with our own power. So yeah, that we'll hopefully see something along those lines in the next couple of years. And I'll end here and leave some time for questions, but really just to say we're big believers that next generation geothermal can be the backbone of the electric grid in both the US and the European and beyond internationally in the international context. And we see that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of gigawatts available with existing drilling technology today. And that just means that climate targets and a number of Scope 2 emission accounting that Devon referenced will be able to pull and utilize the flexibility, the dispatchability, the reliable nature of geothermal power for so much of our operations. And with that, Gregor, I'll hand it over to you and I'll stop sharing as well, and we can get into Q&A.
Thank you so much. It was really an amazing update, exciting what's going on at Fervo Energy. And I think many of our people in the audience will absolutely appreciate. I see there's a first question. Let me briefly start to allow people to speak up. Let's just a second. Yes, here we go. I see Caroline has a question, raised the hand. I think you should be able to unmute. Yes,
Yes.
please go
Hello.
ahead with the question.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Wonderful.
Oh, I want to thank the presenters for the wonderful presentations. My name is Caroline Akinyi. I come from Kenya. I'm a master's student in geology from the University of Nairobi, and I'm a graduate member of the Geothermal Association of Kenya. Here in Kenya, we depend on geothermal energy as the main source of power. And so I would like to ask the second presenter a question. How do they deal with the risks like earthquakes and also in case of blowouts during drilling? Because recently I read a paper on how to discriminate between anthropogenic and natural earthquakes in the geothermal fields. So how do they deal with those risks? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So we take induced seismicity very seriously here, and we actually follow a Department of Energy guideline specifically around using a traffic light system. So we actually have over 27 different monitoring stations at Project Cape alone that monitor just the state of seismic movement. And so using the traffic light system, actually, we have something where you continue operations as normal up until a type 2 event, 2 magnitude event, and then between 2 and 3, it's called a yellow event, which is we would pause operations for 6 hours before we continue. And then for type 3 and above, we would pause operations completely until we're able to understand, just the reasoning and just make sure that we are monitoring and putting health and safety above everything. And I will say, until really like at a magnitude level 4, you don't feel anything on the surface. So we are stopping operations way before you can actually feel any sort of seismic movement on the surface.
Well, thank you so much. And I invite all of you to come visit Kenya. We have amazing geology and also geothermal.
I will on Saturday, yes.
Our CEO is a big fan of Kenya. He went there, he's gone there multiple times, and we hope to more people like from our team will be able to visit soon. Thank you, Caroline.
Yes, and also Kenya applied for the World Geothermal Congress in 2029. They are shortlisted together with Munich, and yeah, I will be there on Saturday to speak with stakeholders, also see the venue. I'm really looking forward to that. Thank you for your input from Kenya. Thank you, Caroline. All right. Anybody with a second question? Otherwise, I have maybe one question to Devon, a bit more again focused on the protocol itself. I hear a lot about electric grid, electrification, but also in geothermal we have the strength, let's say, to be in the direct use for heating and cooling. And if we have a look on the entire energy demand, we see that 40%, maybe even the half, is the demand on heating and cooling. So, are there any considerations to include also this direct method, to include it in the protocol, or would it be too complex?
Yeah, great question, Gregor, because I did focus my remarks today on electricity, because that's how Scope 2 is mainly used by companies today in terms of their reporting. But it also does cover, as I mentioned, heating and cooling as well. And so today, under the Scope 2 guidance, companies can reduce their Scope 2 emissions from purchasing, for instance, clean heat or green heat. And the current update that I mentioned covers electricity specifically, but the protocol actually divided the Scope 2 mandate into two topics. The first was what was called Phase 1, which is these kind of overall updates on the electricity side. And then after this first public consultation, so this means next year, there will be discussions about other topics, which actually includes also the treatment of heating and cooling within Scope 2, and whether or not anything related to the current guidance needs to change there, or how to kind of clarify the use of geothermal, for instance, for heating in Scope 2 emissions. So it is a topic that is relevant, but not treated specifically by the current update that I went over today.
Super, thank you. Yeah. So I still see nothing in the chat yet. I think people still need to digest everything. Maybe one question also again to you, Noor. What do you think? What will be the impact of the Scope 2 update on the business of Fervo Energy, on your core business? How do you think will it influence?
Yeah, I think it will have in fact, quite a sizable influence, specifically because, like Devon said, the GHGP is already used by over 97% of S&P 500 companies. And a lot of the companies that are that require a ton of power today are, in the S&P 500. And so when we're thinking about companies that are ambitious in their growth, that are specifically, let's say, focused, the topic of our time, AI and energy dominance and security, but still at the same time are very prudent and have their own like climate goals. Google is an excellent example. I think for them, like ensuring that they're able to procure or make use of a resource like geothermal it just makes a lot of sense. And so we hope that this continues to push corporations towards more cleaner, more reliable sources like geothermal.
Yeah, One question that definitely came up is on the public consultation, where you, Devon, also posted the link in the chat. So if you're interested, please have a look. What is, if you have a wish list, so what is the perfect input that the geothermal industry can give you via through this public consultation?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely encourage you to look at the link in detail. I think there's a number of ways that the industry can input into this. So one is directly through the consultation process. That is potentially through providing a sort of submission that explains the position of the International Geothermal Association or any particular companies that are interested in responding. So you can provide sort of a kind of, let's say, narrative response as well. There's also a number of detailed questions about different pieces of this update as proposed that I went over in the presentation that the GHGP is asking for comment on. So the association or its companies can also respond directly to particular questions, how it might impact them, how they might be supportive of particular pieces of this. And then I know that there are, there's a lot of other organizations that are paying attention to this, that are also putting in consultations, and also another sort of effort to increase awareness about the role that this standard update could play, particularly for technologies like geothermal that provide around-the-clock clean power or are firm and dispatchable. And so definitely encourage companies to consider joining those efforts as they emerge as well related to this update.
Super. Okay. Oh, the message arrived. Super, thanks. I also see 2 technical questions, and especially to you, Noor. But if you and everybody is fine, today we would really focus on the GHGP and the Scope 2 update. But I think it makes sense maybe to think about an additional session with you, Noor. I think there are a lot of technical questions, and maybe one day we can do that. But yeah, also with an eye on the time, and you still have the opportunity, of course, to ask your questions. But otherwise, I would maybe slowly start to wrap up this webinar. And also, yeah, first of all, thank you, Devon, for this amazing presentations. I think this was really great, and but still to digest and get the connections, I think. It would be brilliant if we can have a follow-up seminar in a couple of months to see where we are. But as a final question, let's say in 5 years from now, and maybe starting with you, with Devon, with a short answer. In 5 years from now, how do you see ideally geothermal positioned in the renewable energy mix, and then also contributing to the Scope 2?
Well, I think, from Google's perspective speaking now, we certainly see incredible promise in geothermal technologies, many different types of geothermal technologies, and advancing grid decarbonization. And that's one of the reasons we've been supporting them as part of our broader portfolio of clean power technologies that we are purchasing from for our energy goals. And I think what's maybe relevant, and just to kind of put another point of emphasis on it regarding the Scope 2 update, is that the current system that we have today doesn't provide any credit for geothermal or any firm dispatchable technology to provide the value that we know that it has for decarbonization and for providing power at times when clean energy is otherwise more scarce. And so by creating a system that recognizes the reality of how power actually is traded and how we use electricity on the grid, we can encourage companies to consider how technologies like geothermal can be part of the portfolios needed to decarbonize not just their own electricity demand in order to make those claims, but also the broader electricity system. And in doing so, we can encourage corporate investment into this sector that doesn't have that same incentive today, which can then lead to transformative change in terms of the development of these technologies and their reduction in cost, as Noor was very helpfully indicating in her presentation. So I hope to see a lot more attention into the geothermal industry from the corporate buying community, and I think these updates will help to facilitate that.
And the same question to you, Noor.
I feel like Devon answered it so brilliantly that I don't need to add anything else. If what Devon says happens, then I think Fervo and the geothermal industry as a whole will be very pleased. So.
And I fully agree. Yeah, maybe also as a small wrap up, with geothermal, we have one benefit, but it's also our problem in communication. So we have a very small footprint. A lot is happening subsurface. So it's really hard to see. Again, we have a small footprint. This is our pro. But the same, it is hard to explain. It is somewhere here, and that I think with this is it can really, really help, yeah, to bring geothermal also to the forefront of the renewable energy mix, and yeah, make us a bit more visible. So in that sense, I think it's brilliant. And of course, we all want a clear, and green future, and in that sense, always welcome to yeah. I'm really happy to see this happening, and congrats and thank you for your work on this. Yeah, this is simply amazing. All right, I think I need to get my language back. Please excuse me for yeah, some problems in translation, but I think we made it. Yeah, thank you again, Devon, Noor, and Noor, for really a brilliant webinar. Thank everybody for participating. If you have any questions that come up after this webinar, please feel free to contact us. Send your email to iga@lovegeothermal.org. We will forward the questions and get back to you. Yeah, but for now, I thank you everybody for participating. Wherever you are, I wish you a great morning, afternoon, evening, and I look forward to welcoming you to our next webinar. Thank you, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.